While the V model is still heavily used, especially in the embedded system industry, there's a newer approach under the umbrella of Agile Methods that attempts to solve the problem of what happens when requirements aren't known at the beginning of a project, or how do you deal with requirements that are likely to change without waiting around for all the requirements to be perfect before you start executing. There's a thing called the Agile Manifesto, which is worth a read, and a summary of some of the key values is it values individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It values working software over comprehensive documentation. It values customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and it values responding to change over following a plan. Now, these principles can be very helpful in certain situations, but it's important to note that these are relative statements. For example, working software over comprehensive documentation. That does not mean zero paper. What it means is the emphasis is on working software, and so on. An example Agile method approach is Scrum. In the Scrum process, there are daily stand-ups where people actually stand up to keep the meeting short, otherwise known as scrums. And that's a daily way for people to have face-to-face collaboration and communication to make sure things keep moving. Work is organized in generally 2 to 4 week long sprints to incrementally add functionality. So instead of one big waterfall or even one big V, the way it works is for each 2 to 4 week long sprint, you take a few things that you want to build from the requirements backlog and you build them in a couple, 3 weeks, and then you demo at the end of the sprint. And theoretically, at the end of every sprint is a shippable product. So the idea is instead of building everything at once, you get something working, and over time, over each sprint, you add some more functions, and eventually it becomes a minimum viable product, something you can ship to a customer, and then over time you keep adding more functions. And the point of all this is that at every sprint you have the opportunity to notice that a requirement has changed or a new requirement has been added instead of having to go back and redo everything. Now the Scrum method, as well as most Agile methods, can be mapped to something like a V, but the terminology is different. For example, instead of requirements, there are user stories, but in fact, they perform a very similar function. Agile methods are not a free lunch. They come with their own challenges. Challenges I've seen in Agile approaches include if you have a geographically split team, especially in different time zones, it can make it difficult to do informal communications. This is typically resolved by having one team in each time zone or one team in each location and somehow coordinating across the teams. If there are external dependencies, such as another part of a system changes, this can also cause a problem because the idea is at the beginning of a Scrum, you take a snapshot of the system, you add some features, you're done at the end. But if other teams have also been making changes at the end, you have to deal with a reintegration problem of all the different changes that might not play nice with each other. By far, the biggest challenge with an Agile approach is that there's no time for extensive hardware-based testing at the end. There's a general presumption that all the tests are mostly automated or can be done in a very short amount of time. You only have 2 or 3 weeks, and that includes the testing. So they work best when you can automate or have very simple tests, but when tests involve setting up real hardware, loading in the software, and then running a bunch of physical tests on a piece of hardware, it can be a real challenge to fit that into a sprint.